Hi there, guys. I want to welcome you to our in-practice session, COVID Secure Learning, Putting Guidelines into Action this afternoon at the MA's online annual conference. My name's Eleanor and I'll be facilitating today's session and I just have a few housekeeping announcements to make before I hand over to Jane Sillis, the Director of Engage. Firstly, as attendees, your cameras and microphones should be automatically disabled, but you can use the chat function on your menu bar to talk, to introduce yourselves, talk to others, share links and experiences. You can also use the hashtag Museums2020. There is live closed captioning available at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Just click closed caption and show full subtitles. And there is also audio description via the interpretation button and just click on the French channel for live description. If you have a question that you'd like the panel to address, then please share this via the Q&A, which you should be able to see in the menu bar as well. You can ask a question, but please do share your name and organisation if you can. Jane, our chair, will put selected questions you've asked to the panel after everybody's spoken, so please keep these short and to the point to help her out. You can leave and rejoin the webinar at any time, and we're recording this discussion today and it will be available on our website in due course. Finally, please bear with us if there are any technical hitches during the webinar and send me a private message if you're having any trouble. Right now, I shall hand you over to Jane to get started. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was really helpful. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jane Sillis and I'm the Director of Engage, the National Association for Gallery Education. I'm going to introduce our speakers and just give you a sense of how we're going to spend the next 45 minutes. So it's brilliant to have colleagues here today to talk about COVID Secure Learning. Sally Bacon, who's Executive Director of the Clore Duffield Foundation, Sam Cairns from Cairns Associates, and Kate Fellows, who's Head of Learning and Access at Leeds Museums and Galleries. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to do, Sally and Sam will speak for about 10 minutes and then Kate will follow on and speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for your questions. So as Eleanor said, please do put your questions in the Q&A function. I'll try and draw out a few kind of really pithy questions and offer those to our speakers. Just to give you a brief sense of the context that my colleagues are going to speak about, over the summer and autumn, the Group for Education Museums Engage with the Clore Learning Spaces have been working with learning and education and participation colleagues in different art forms right across the United Kingdom. And we've used that pool of colleagues to draw together some really valuable resources, really to try and help support COVID secure learning and participatory work. As you'll find out over the next 45 minutes, this is an ongoing project. It's been fueled by the generosity of colleagues working in this area of work. And it's really about trying to ensure that key work around education, learning and participation can carry on. And it feels very, very pertinent talking about this now as you go into a second lockdown. So quite a practical approach today, and I hope time for questions. So I really particularly wanted to thank the Clore Duffield Foundation for supporting this work, and also the Group for Education Museums and other networks who supported this process. So I'd like to invite Sally to speak first and then Sam to follow.
Thanks, Jane. A great intro. Hello, I'm Sally from Clore Duffield. Lovely to be talking to all of you today. I've run the foundation for a very long time and have over that time overseen our grant making to a huge number of museums and galleries, but particularly to fund Clore Learning Spaces. I think we've done 66 over the last 2 decades. So we have, in parallel to that, thought long and hard about how we're helpful to those spaces, because we've seen all the planning processes and all the pitfalls of creating them. So we gradually built up our own informal guidance, which we over the years formalized into a publication which came out in 2015, Space for Learning, published with the then Heritage Lottery Fund and Arts Council England and plenty of others, probably Gem and Engage. I can't even remember now. It's quite a list of supporters that we worked with for that, but it's been incredibly helpful, I think, and it's altered the type of applications we get, because by the time they land on my desk, everyone knows what they're doing. There's a really good and helpful checklist in it. Clearly, when COVID hit, every single one of those spaces closed. And that physical infrastructure that we'd invested in to the tune of about £30 million over those 2 decades ceased to be of use for a period. You know, this will end, we'll get back in those spaces somehow and at some point. But Sam and I immediately thought that what we needed was to adapt the Space for Learning guidance to a COVID context. And we never do anything on our own. There's no point. So of course, it was brilliant immediately to work with Engage, to work with Gem, and to work with the Theatre Education Forum, because we took a crucial decision at this point that this wasn't just for museums and galleries and heritage, that we needed to work with our theatre and performing arts colleagues as well, because they had the same problems, were probably in more pain with regard to the closure, because it's harder for them to reopen now with audiences. But everyone would have the same issues if they had a learning space that they ordinarily welcomed learning groups and school visitors into. So it immediately got activated into something involving lots of colleagues, far beyond, above and beyond the 66 heads of learning and colleagues in those Clore learning spaces. So it's evolved into a very collaborative project that we've been working on over the last few months. So I think it's probably time for Sam to tell you a bit more about how that's been happening.
Thanks, Sally. I'm going to make sure I time myself. I think we really touched on the sort of range of art forms and how many people contributed to this. We had an original meeting of about 50 colleagues back in May, saying, what do people need to know? What information do people need to think about how they're going to reopen their spaces, to think about how they might reimagine their services, or the different ways in which they want to work. And the immediate thing we did was to pull together advice, guidance, promising practice from this big range of colleagues. And we ended up with a working group. Obviously, furlough impacted people's availability and obviously caring responsibilities, but we ended up with an amazing group of around 20 to 25 people, depending on what day of the week, you know, phase of the moon for childcare and all those things we had. And the working group split into task and finish groups, and we put together advice on different areas. What I'm going to do now is show you the website, which I need to emphasize is a work in progress, because the information keeps changing about how to deliver COVID secure activities. And I think we learn more about how best to do it. So Kate's going to talk a bit more in a minute about the best ways to think about delivering and what they're doing. But first of all, I'm just going to show you the website so that you can see where to go for information, but also to say I'm apologise for things that come and go on it in terms of the government guidance, because that seems to be coming and going a bit at the moment. So this is the front page of the COVID guidance section of the Space for Learning website. If you click on this main bit up here, it will actually take you back to the regular guidance that Sally mentioned that we put together in terms of when you're actually planning a learning space and the things you need to think about. And then we have this specific COVID guidance section. There is this advice available as a PDF download. So if you've got problems with internet access or you need to share it differently, you can print it out. As a quick disclaimer, I have been updating the website today with information about government guidance for England, Scotland and Wales. Scotland and Wales we're still drafting. England we just have some information up. We're expecting a bit more information from the Department for Education to clarify. the PDF doesn't have that new data on yet, and when it does, it will say on the front of it, so that it will say it was updated in November instead of October. The other thing just to note on this front page, as I scroll down, is that this is an ongoing project, as you can guess, from the fact we keep updating, and I keep going back to ask working groups to help refine the advice and guidance. We have been running workshops once a month. We initially said we'd run 3, so we ran one the first Thursday of the month in October. We have one this afternoon about blended learning, and we're planning on running one on the 3rd of December. We think, we're not quite sure, it's going to be about case studies about doing COVID secure delivery, but they'll either be about delivering on site or delivering off-site. We'll wait and see what people this afternoon say they want. And we may also carry on with these workshops in the new year if people are interested and want to keep coming to them. They are, of course, free. It's all funded by Clore Duffield. The other pages I just wanted to flag up to you is the information includes links to research. Everything in this is very much about, here's our summary of the information, and here are further links to go and find the guidance and the official stuff. So there's information about ventilation, about airflow and air conditioning, thinking about visitor numbers. And the other thing which I thought you would be interested to see is there's a whole section on different information about delivering activities. And Kate's going to talk, I think, a bit more in detail about them and obviously their contribution to this. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to hand over to Kate now, I think. Thank you for that.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a good afternoon. It seems particularly slightly odd talking about reopening programmes on a day that we've all closed buildings to the public, even if you can still have staff going in. But we've got to have hope. There are still things we can do and ways in which we can work, and we've got to have hope that we can deliver things in the way we want to deliver them, just keeping them safe and secure for everybody. So I've got some PowerPoint slides. I have to say they are quite text heavy, which is not the way I usually work, but there's a lot of information to convey. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and you should in a moment be able to see a blue screen with a white writing on and the logos at the bottom. Can somebody on the panel give me a thumbs up if you can? Excellent, that's lovely. Just checking that hopefully all of you out there can see that. So we're going to talk about how we do COVID secure learning and engagement, and we're going to cover some of the research about COVID. Then we're going to think about how we keep spaces and people safe as managers running organisations, and as managers I kind of think of us as self-managers, space managers, project managers, so you don't have to have manager in your title. This is about leadership at all levels, on outreach or in settings other than your own, in workshops, gallery spaces and self-directed learning. Then we're going to think about how we plan for specific audiences where COVID has had a massive impact. Okay, so the research. I'm sorry, this is a very boring slide. It is a big table with 3 columns. Down the first column it has different materials. In the second it has one piece of research and the times to no viable virus. And in the third column it has again a different set of times to no viable virus. So the materials are copper with 4 hours, cardboard and paper. The first bit of research says 24 hours, the second says 3 days. Stainless steel, 48 hours or 7 days, quite scary. Plastic, 72 hours, or again, a long time, 7 days. Glass, fabric and wood were all in the second piece of research, not the first, and 4 days and 24 hours respectively. The reason I put up the different bits of research is there are scientists across the globe trying to find out about coronavirus. And obviously we have to take that science into account, be led by the science folks in what we're doing, but they are all going to come up with different things because they are working under different methodologies. So the second column there has the 72 hours for plastic in it. Now that is the industry standard. That's what most people have been talking about. That 72 hours is going to become really key. So hold on to that time frame. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But the other piece of research was done using a different methodology. So if the first piece was done by touch, so how much virus was viably left on an object where you could touch it and it would be transferred to you, then the second piece of research was done much more on a chemical basis. So how much chemically could you remove of the virus after a certain amount of time? Now, obviously for us in museums, it's the touch aspect that's probably most useful. We're not going to be going and covering our objects in chemicals to see whether there's virus left. but it's there so that we can look at the different bits of research and then analyse the methodologies behind it. The links to the research are at the bottom. I have to say they're quite dense texts. I wouldn't recommend them for bedtime reading, put it that way. So the next bit of research is that the virus survives longer on smoother surfaces, as you will have seen from the table, like plastic and stainless steel. And in colder conditions, it survives longer. Freezing does not kill this virus, which is a massive blow for us in terms of museums, because in Leeds museums and galleries, where I have my day job, we have a giant industrial freezer, like I'm guessing some of you guys do. And when you take out objects, you put them back through the freezer and it kills all the pests before you put them back in the stores. Well, this is not going to kill that virus. However, our freezer goes on for 7 days at a time, and that time lag will kill the virus. So freezing itself won't, but the time lag probably will of them being in the freezer. What does destroy the virus is light and heat, the two things that we don't want anywhere near museum objects generally. So if you've got a nice, sunny, well-ventilated, nice warm room in the summer, virus will survive much less time than it will as we come into winter. Now, at the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about touch transmission, about door handles and things. Those are still really important, but as you'll have picked up through probably the social media and the news and things, it's actually aerosol transmission that's the big worry now. And about that droplet, it's about people breathing on stuff in essence. So there's another piece of research that's been done that says if you've got a nice sunny day in the middle of summer and you're outside, the 90% destruction rate of the virus will be about 6 minutes. But on an autumn day, a bit like it is today in Leeds, it's quite cloudy, that will take 19 minutes. So that's a considerably amount longer than the 6. And obviously, as we get into winter and it's colder and it's darker, these kind of things can have an impact on where you're thinking about delivering activities and how you're thinking about delivering. So what do we need to think about as managers? And again, I say this is about management in its biggest, broadest sense. If you have staff, and I include you in this as well, are they risk assessed? Do they need individual risk assessments? In Leeds, we have an individual risk assessment pro forma on the council, which goes through all the risks, and they are self-defined risks by the individual in terms of their vulnerability. So it's about consulting the person you might be putting at risk first before assuming different things. But those staff will probably need extra training on things, and certainly PPE. Lots of people are using the visors and masks with clear panels for access so that you can still lip read. But obviously you have to remember that all of those have reflective surfaces. So think about how the light bounces around in your space and whether your viewers can still see what you're talking about. Thinking about your cancellation policies is also something that's a good managerial point. Have you looked at them in the light of COVID? And if you're employing people, what does that mean if you're paying them and things like that? As Leeds, I've never spent so much time on cancellation policies. Wow. I mean, normally we've got one that goes across commercial and learning, and it's a big lot of terms and conditions. This time we've had a table with all different kinds of permutations. What happens if the group we're working with who are paying us a workshop fee happen to be in a different tier and they can't visit us, or we can't have them in? Who cancels, and how do we reimburse that, or do we just move it? All of those kind of conversations are ones you probably ought to be having as you start to open up. With more stuff moving online, there's been a lot around digital safeguarding. So have you updated your policies in terms of that? And in terms of vulnerable audiences, obviously, if you work with learning disabled adults, sometimes that can be really difficult in terms of the social distancing. So what can you put in place? What measures, and how are you going to communicate that that is a really important thing to keep everyone safe? Finally, for this one, how green are your measures? Now, environmental sustainability, we know there is a climate crisis. As Leeds Museums and Galleries, we had essentially got rid of paper trails across the service, or were desperately trying to. Now we've brought them back over the summer as grab bags for family activities, because that was the only way we could think of doing some kind of engagement in a COVID secure way. We got rid of them because we didn't want them littering up the place, and it was creating massive amounts of environmental impact. Now we've brought that back, How long is that going to last? What are we going to do? Families aren't leaving them in the building like they used to. They are taking them with them, but are they going in the recycling, and should we be doing that at all? Lots of interesting discussions to be had there. Now, in workshop situations, this could be schools, booked workshops, adult learning's regular programs. Obviously, we're probably not going to be doing any of this for the next 4 weeks or maybe beyond, but you need to stick to your government's advice. All 4 nations now say different things about working in different environments. So have a look at that as a first port of call. As Sam says, it's there in the space for learning guidance, so you can take that as a starting point, but think about those kind of things. In terms of the overall environment you might be delivering in, outside might be a really good place to start, but obviously we don't want to freeze in the winter. This is Britain, it's quite cold. So you might want to think about weatherproofing it a little bit, putting up marquees, but that then might have its own kind of level of permissions around that. So lots of local authorities at the moment are being a bit more lenient on some of their planning rules to put up temporary structures to enable things to happen. But obviously, if you're working on an archaeological site, you can't put tent pegs into the ground, so your marquee might not work. And you'll still have a different level of health and safety, of risk assessment, that kind of thing. And if you're inside, windows open, lights on, make sure you're thinking about your cleaning and your spacing and your furniture. One of the key things to think about might be the physicality of the activity. So if you're doing dance, drama, music, something that might involve moving around a little bit more, you might want to look at different aspects of different guidance. So if you're doing dance or drama, the Sport England or the theatre guidance might be more appropriate for the activity that you're doing. And the Arts Council are doing some research about how woodwind instruments and aerosol transmission and things like that. So that might be worth looking up. You'll need access to hand washing, and obviously the 72-hour rule kicks in, and this is where 72 hours comes back. If you're working with museum objects, and we always work in Leeds with accessioned museum objects, you will need different sets of objects if you're going to rotate them any quicker than 72 hours. So if you're having groups in on consecutive days, you need different sets of objects and quarantine those for 72 hours. So you'll need processes in place. If you're working with art materials, this goes for those as well. You either need to be able to clean them, which could be a really boring, long, laborious task. We've done some of that over the summer, wiping pens with antibacterial wipes, or you just get extra sets, but that's going to have a really big financial implication. So worth thinking about that. On outreach, and by this I mean working in any unknown setting that's not your usual base. That's the biggest question I have as a manager before my staff go into different places, is actually about the spaces they're going into, because we can't control it. We don't know what processes they've got in place. So the key part for this is talking to those people who manage those groups and those spaces. And it might end up being a 3-way conversation, because if you're working in a community venue with a group who also borrows the space, you'll end up with the triangle. Ask them what measures are already in place, the ventilation and the cleaning. Ask them to share risk assessments and talk really openly about what happens if there's a local lockdown. What does that mean for you if you're in the same area or if you're crossing boundaries? Obviously, there's big geographical boundaries between England and Wales, England and Scotland, but you might be thinking about crossing county boundaries too. What does that mean? And again, the 72-hour rule. Some people are working on outreach. So Wakefield Museums and Sheffield Museums Trust have both done successful outreach into schools. And shout out to you guys if you're out there. Thank you very much. There are case studies on the Space for Learning website, so you can read about what they've been doing. They found it fairly straightforward, but I think certainly Sheffield, when I was talking to them, they took a large Greek temple that you build out into schools, and actually their stumbling block was thinking about who was going to drive the van to get the thing there, rather than the actual outreach into schools. So it's quite practical things that you might need to think through, that we're all really used to thinking through, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Now, thinking about on-gallery things. So when our buildings reopen again, what have we got in terms of those interactives in spaces that the instantaneous reaction might have been, take them away, they're not safe. So how can we reopen those kind of programs and things? think about which areas of your building are going to be open in the first place. So in Leeds, we reopened all our museums and galleries across the summer, but not necessarily all of every building, because there were cross points and too narrow points and things like that. So some places weren't open. There is no sense in dealing with and trying to make safe and interactive in a bit that's closed. Quite straightforward, really. But the conversations we had behind the scenes were much more about cleaning rotas, and how frequently those interactives were going to be cleaned that were still around and were still able to be played with. So if we've got building blocks, who is going to be sanitising those on a regular basis? That's a conversation with generally your front of house and cleaning teams. It's about mitigating those high touch surfaces, cleaning them. You might be able to change materials for some of them. You might think about signage and hand sanitizer, you know, the nice polite sign that says, please hand sanitize before and after using this. Some of the members of the public might do it just one of those. So obviously you want them to do it both so that that object is clean. But there we go. Think about how these are going to, if you've removed things, are they sensory things that make the experience good for people with additional needs? So think about that. And finally, really importantly, if things have been removed, make sure that you've got a timetable, not necessarily a date and a time because things keep shifting, but what happens when things release to be able to put things back. We have worked as a sector for years to try and get so much family friendliness and interactivity into all our spaces. We don't want that to go now. So think about that. The ALSA, the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions, and the Visit Britain research, that the link is at the bottom, is worth reading, because actually those are coming up with surveys where they've asked people over the summer, so culturally savvy folks who have been to museums in the middle of a pandemic and visitor attractions, and what they've found is if those are charged for, then people feel that they're not getting their full amount of money's worth, if not the whole building is open and they can't access the entire experience. So think about those areas of interactivity and think about them as adding value, as we know, to the whole experience. I think the key thing here is something that I heard Bernard Donoghue from the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions say, which is sanitize and make the environment safe, don't sanitize the experience. So when you're in gallery, you want to feel like you're having that experience. In terms of self-directed learning, these things might be backpacks, self-directed learning, self-directed crafts. Again, it's the 72-hour rule, and it's about cleaning. If you've got a family backpack, have you got enough of them to quarantine them for 72 hours? Can you clean them between each use? Is that going to cause the front of house a massive headache? Can families bring their own things onto site that they don't normally do? I know some theatres and other cultural settings are doing this, but there might be conservation issues. I can imagine if a family turned up with a whole bunch of watercolours and some water in a flask and said, we're just going to paint watercolours in the middle of your picture gallery in Temple Newsome, but I think it might send up some of our staff into fits. Yeah, I don't think they'd think it was appropriate, put it that way. So I think it might be worth tempering some of that. Again, it's if removed, there must be a timetable for reintroduction. And then there's been lots and lots of lovely local art pack schemes going on across the country. So some of the examples are below, but there's probably one that's gone on in your local area. And I know there are talks about it being for the phase 2 lockdown as well. So see if you can get involved with some of those. The Royal Shakespeare Company did some lovely work with Bradford. Arts Council England have done bags of creativity up in Yorkshire and possibly in other areas of the country. The one I wanted to highlight from the case studies is the National Museums Wales, shout out to you guys, did sleepovers during lockdown. So they did digital, linked up, blended learning, sleepovers. They are awesome. Have a look at them. There's a blog post on it. Now, thinking about audiences that have been particularly affected by COVID, I've put 2 audiences together, and again, I don't necessarily believe we should do this, but about special educational needs and disabilities and early years. But the reason I've put them together is they rely on touch more than any of our other audiences. So if you're thinking about, you probably already do programs for them and how on earth you can keep these going. Think about your government guidance on numbers and households and who can mix and who can't mix. you've got to have access to hand washing because you need that touch factor. The 72-hour rule means you can't swap between groups, so they may have to have an individual object for that group, but that's all fine if you've got enough objects. The key part here is about social stories and welcome videos. You've probably seen some that happened across the summer, but we might need to update them in the light of current guidance. If you've got somebody who happens to have an autistic spectrum condition, say in the family, then they may find it really difficult to visit a familiar environment that's got unfamiliar things in it. And a welcome film is one of the ways that you can showcase what the museum have been doing and how things will have changed before they even leave the house, to help with that journey and to help them come back on. Loads and loads of people have done brilliant things, and there's some of the case studies, and I would always check out the Disability Collaborative Network, shout out to Becky who runs that. That's got lots of good guidance on their website as well, and follow them on Twitter. That would be my advice. In terms of what we need to consider for schools, because I'm guessing lots of you run school visits and you may have had some on site and you may not have done, look at the specific guidance for your nation. The Department for Education in England has been quite, I mean, as Sam said, the guidance is changing, but they have at least mentioned educational visits. Whereas in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, that's been less clear up until this point. So might be worth unpicking some of that or talking to advisors if you're in those nations. What we have found while we were talking about the space for learning guidance more broadly is that while we're talking to professionals who are also talking to schools in their areas, lots of schools have embargoed visits until at least Easter next year. Now, we were talking to them in September, October time, so this might have even been pushed back. And it's for three main reasons. One is insurance. If it all goes wrong in a COVID sense, then they can't get the insurance, the coach costs back via insurance. So that's one reason. Financial, purely straightforward. The other one is staffing. Obviously, schools are running on a skeleton staff at the moment, and all it takes is a couple of staff to be tracked and traced and back in self-isolation for the school or the bubble to close. So they don't have enough staff for our ratios and for them to feel safe. And there's a massive thing around parental concern as well. Do you want your child as a parent going somewhere where you don't know what procedures they've got in place, even if you think they might be safe? But schools may have visitors in school from this term, and I know some people had planned the outreach, and as I say, Wakefield and Sheffield know it. Culturally engaged schools are looking for ways to engage virtually, digitally, through blended learning, through loans boxes. There's lots of support through GEM out there for those kind of things. So if you want to set up blended learning or loans boxes, things like that, then contact GEM and they'll be able to put you in contact with the right people. From a personal perspective, I would say that relationships are key. The schools we have had the best engagement with as Leeds Museums and Galleries over the last 6-9 months have been the schools where we have really key, strong relationships. They are culturally savvy, yes, we may have picked up a couple of others around the sides, but it's the ones where we know their staff and they're asking us for things. So we're tailoring it to them. And in general, schools are focusing on their catch-up and their recovery curriculums. And that's what we've been working with lots of the schools in Leeds on at the moment too. There's another link to the Space for Learning guidance and some of the other ones I'd look at for the guidance across the nations. Finally, if you want a bit of inspiration, and I think we all do at the moment, the Clore leadership team have been putting together films on YouTube. Have a look at them because they're really good. And it gives you that 5-10 minute little boost that we might need at the moment. If you need any questions answering we're going to go to questions in a minute, but there's my email address and my Twitter handle, just get in contact. There we go. I'm going to stop the share and bring us back for questions. There we go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sally, Sam and Kate. That was brilliant. So there are some quite specific questions, so it would be brilliant if the panelists could just have a look at the questions which are in the Q&A box. And then if we can deal with those first, and then actually I was going to ask you a slightly bigger question. So there's a question from Ruth Fletcher at the Hunterian about the rule of 6 and whether or not student volunteers should be included within that number. And I wondered, Kate, if you could try and answer that, please.
Oh, blimey, the amount of questions and the amount of conversations we have had as a senior leadership team in Leeds about the ins and outs of both track and trace and the number of people you can have in a room. I have to say, I am not completely au fait with all of the Scottish guidance, so I'm probably not the best placed person to answer it. I know the English guidance and that keeps changing, but I haven't quite got my head around the Scottish one. Sorry, Ruth. We go with the
and so there's a Kate, that was really helpful. Actually, I can see there are colleagues in Scotland who are taking part in the discussion. Particularly, I can see that Siobhan from National Galleries of Scotland is with us. So it would be brilliant if others know, if they could respond in the chat. That would be really cool. And so, Sam, there's a question from Amanda more about DFE schools guidance and visitors going into school buildings, and I wondered if you could help with that, please.
Just on Ruth's question about the max 2 households and 6 people is absolutely right for tier 3 in Scotland, and my understanding is if the student volunteer, if you say they are a member of our staff team because they are part of how we are running it, then they do not need to be counted within the 6 people, because anyone working to deliver something doesn't count. So when you run a support group, which are allowed to continue, which was, I think someone else was talking about things which sounded like support groups to me. If you're running a support group, and the definition of a support group is under the government guidance section in the space for learning thing, it's in the English bit, you're allowed up to 15 people in a support group, plus the members of staff needed to run that support group. Just on the DFE school guidance, they've published some guidance which came out on the 4th, which wasn't very clear, and we are querying it with One Dance UK and What Next, just to try and get a bit more things, because at the moment it says peripatetic teachers are allowed into schools. So I think it comes down to your definition of unnecessary visitors. So if you say we are necessary for children's education, then the school, and it also, I've heard the guidance from Department for Education described as Teflon guidance, because nothing will stick to it, it's all the school's fault. So individual schools will have to make a call on what they consider necessary visitors, and if they believe that the peripatetic teachers, i.e. museums, heritage, arts education, professionals coming in to support their children's education are necessary, then that would be allowed. But I think it's each individual school having to make a decision about that.
Okay, thanks, Sam. That's really helpful. So there's a question here from Gareth Morgan about ways to increase airflow into learning spaces. And I wondered, Sally, actually, if you had any thoughts on that, or otherwise, Sam. But Sally, do you want to respond to that?
I think Sam would be the person to talk about that.
I actually was thinking, I don't know if any of you know Stephen Heppel. He has a website which I'll find and put it in the chat, and he does loads of really interesting research about how environment affects learning, and he has worked together with a not-for-profit to create learner meters that you can put in any space, which measure things like CO2 and temperature, because there's a lot of research around things like how CO2 affects learning. So in classrooms where there are on average higher levels of CO2 than other classrooms, the teachers who teach more frequently in those classrooms go off sick more. I mean, there's all those sorts of bits of information. I don't immediately know how to improve the airflow other than having the windows open and the fans pushing the air through, but I would look on Stephen Heppel's website on the ventilation section and see if there's any quick fixes there, because he's really good, because he also talks about if you've got lots of money, here is what you might do, but actually if you need to sort this in a low cost way, here are some ways that people are doing it, and here is the science behind it.
And I think, Jane, it's so context specific. Everyone's, some people have basement spaces, that are really tricky to manage, and some people have lots of possible routes to ventilating more freely. And certainly schools are telling kids to wear more clothes because they'll keep all the windows open. My son's been told to wear a lot of layers. So
The other thing to watch in terms of ventilation is where, if you're lucky enough to have air handling systems, where they extract into. So you might need to look at your building plans, because if you've got, I know there's one museum service where the air handling systems from the galleries empties into the learning space and then back out again. And obviously you can't have it transferring between galleries, so they can't use their learning space at the moment temporarily, so they've had to use other spaces.
That's cool. There's some great practical advice here, so thanks everyone. And actually, Kate, I wondered if you could help with, there's a question here about guided tours from a colleague in Birmingham.
Excuse me. Yes, they can, but they're limited to one household. It depends what tier you're under and what restrictions you've got. So check your local restrictions. I know Birmingham were under tier 3 before we entered lockdown, I think, or about to go in maybe tier 2. If you're doing single ones for single households, that's probably the best way around it and the most sustainable way. People who I know who've done it really well, Rowan Dahl's house in Great Missenden, hello if you're listening, they did bespoke family tours. So they made a real marketing opportunity of it and said, actually, we'll ask you a series of questions as you book on your tour, and then we will tailor your tour to your favourite Rowan Dahl book, which made for a really lovely marketing opportunity, really bespoke thing for the family, and also adhered to all the government guidance. So that might be worth a look.
That's great, Kate. Thanks very much. And I can see colleagues are responding to some of these questions in the chat too. So thank you. That's really generous. It's incredibly kind. So Sam, I wonder if you can help with a question here from Peter Nurek, who's asking really about, is the balance between the autonomy that organisations have against the government guidance?
I think a lot of it's going to come down to your attitude to risk, I think, because I think there is a lot of autonomy, because it's up to you as leaders and up to your board and all deciding together, saying this is our risk assessment, this is our understanding of the situation, this is our understanding of the guidance and the rules and of the actual risks, because we don't want our visitors to get sick. So it is about saying this is what we believe is a reasonable interpretation of what we should be doing. There's obviously laws and fines around things that you are very specifically not allowed to do, but I actually think there's quite a lot of grey areas, like the things around support groups. I think you could make quite a strong argument about museum support groups carrying on at the moment. So if you have a support group for people to help with their well-being, or a support group that helps parents, new parents with small babies, all those sorts of things, I think you could make a very strong argument that they should continue. But it is about your risk assessment and your sense of, actually, is this appropriate given what we know at the moment in this point, and are you happy to be able to defend that to Public Health England? Because I know for some schools, for example, they are being contacted by Public Health England, like schools and academy trusts, saying, are you observing these things? Can you prove this? So it's like lots of other risks that you assess for and to be able to justify what you're doing. But I'm sorry, there's no right or wrong answer.
Thanks, Sam. Actually, that was a really clear answer. That's brilliant. We've got 2 minutes left, and I just want to say this is such a helpful, practical session. I wanted to ask the panelists one question, which is, what is the most important thing that you've learned in terms of providing COVID secure learning since the first lockdown, and as we go into the second one? And Sally, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, everyone works together. It's the only way. Kate, it's been brilliant having Kate involved and all the colleagues on this, and actually I interviewed 66 heads of learning through the summer for the donations actually that we've made to our Clore learning spaces. And I felt a degree of isolation between people struggling with their own problems in the context of the pandemic. The more everyone works together, the better. Because we can share the guidance and support each other. So that would be the number one thing from me.
Thanks, Sally, and I'd really concur with that, and I'm sure Jem would too. Kate, is there one thing really briefly?
I would completely echo what Sally said. Actually, it's about talking, it's about opening up those conversations, whether that's with schools, whether that's with groups, whether that's with colleagues. And what I found really refreshing is all the way through, people have genuinely asked how you are and listened to the outcome in terms of caring about each other's well-being, and that idea of kindness coming through. I think that's really important.
Fantastic. And I'm afraid I think we're out of time now.
Yep, go on, let Sam say something first.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Eleanor.
I agree with the relationships and the conversations, but my other thing would be being really comfortable with risk assessments. And actually, they're not scary, that, you know, that they're quite easy to do. You do the columns, and actually just being comfortable with the risk assessment and going through it in a really methodical way is the way forward, I think, if you're worried about things.
I agree with everything everyone said, and I think that kind of, if we can really retain that spirit of generosity, which I think has been so evident since the whole COVID pandemic started, but also kind of really seek to work together, that seems to be incredibly important. And I suppose I've experienced real generosity and partnership, and I think it's really, really important to retain that so we can retain our optimism. I just really like to thank all of the speakers today, and also Group for Education Museums for pulling the session together. And thanks all of you for your fantastic questions and all the kind of brilliant observations and comments in the chat.
Thank you so much, Jane. That's been such an essential session with so much important information and advice. So thank you, Kate, Jane, Sam, Sally, and as Jane said, the Group for Education and Museums, really brilliant. And I think the slide link has gone round in the chat. So Kate, thank you for that. So there's just a 20-minute break now before a keynote from Maggie Appleton, the President of the Museums Association, the AGM, and the Museums Change Lives Awards. So thank you so much again, everybody. Thank you for your brilliant chat and questions, and see you next time. Thank you.